had been living in my apartment for 2 years. Last month I found a door I had never seen before, behind a bookshelf. I had never moved. It opened into a room that was not on my floor plan, and the room was not empty. Wait, it gets worse. Tonight we have 5 stories that start in ordinary places and end somewhere you will never forget. Stay until story 5, because that one will change how you look at your own house. Tonight, let me take you back to where this all started. Story 1 begins. My name is James. I am 36 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon, and 6 weeks ago I moved my bookshelf to repaint the wall behind it and found a door. Not a small door, a full-size door, hinged with a handle, that had been positioned exactly behind the bookshelf in a way that made me understand immediately that the bookshelf had been placed there specifically to conceal it. I had lived in this apartment for 2 years. I had placed the bookshelf where it was on the day I moved in because the previous tenant had left a faint rectangular mark on the floor that suggested something heavy had stood there before, and the bookshelf had fit the space exactly. I had not thought about that until I moved the bookshelf and found the door. I stood in my living room and looked at a full-size door for a long moment. Then I called my building manager, a man named Frank, and described what I had found and asked him to come look at it before I opened it. Frank arrived 20 minutes later. He looked at the door for a moment and said he did not know it was there. He said the building had been converted from a larger single unit in the 1970s, and that the conversion had apparently left some structural irregularities that were not always fully documented. He asked if I wanted to open it. I told him I did not want to open it without him present, and that I wanted to open it now rather than later, because I had been sleeping in this apartment for 2 years with a concealed door in my living room, and I needed to know what was on the other side. Frank opened the door. The room behind it was approximately 8 feet by 10 feet with a low ceiling, no windows, and a concrete floor. It had electricity. There was a working light fixture with a pull cord that Frank tested. It contained a folding chair, a small side table, an extension cord that was plugged into a wall outlet and had a phone charger plugged into its other end, and 3 protein bar wrappers that were not dusty. I want to stop on the protein bar wrappers. They were not dusty. I had been in my apartment for 2 years. The room had been accessed by someone recently enough that the wrappers had not accumulated the dust that everything else in the room, the chair, the table, the light cord, had accumulated. Someone had been in this room more recently than 2 years ago, possibly more recently than I could determine by looking. Frank called the police. The police came and documented the room and the wrappers. A forensic technician collected the wrappers. The investigation identified fingerprints. The fingerprints matched a man named Gary who had been the building's maintenance contractor 2 years earlier, before my tenancy, and who had apparently retained a key to the concealed room and had been accessing it during periods when my apartment had been empty, using it as a private space for reasons the investigation did not fully establish, but that had included, evidently, charging his phone and eating protein bars. Gary was charged with trespassing and criminal entry. My building changed all locks and conducted a full structural review that found no other undocumented spaces. The bookshelf is gone. I have not replaced it. The door is visible from my living room now, and I have painted it the same color as the wall, and in a certain light you can almost forget it is a door. In a certain light. Update 4 months later. Gary's case concluded last month with a guilty plea and a sentence that included community service and a requirement to have no contact with the building or its residents. My building manager Frank told me about the outcome, and then told me something he had apparently been sitting with since the discovery. That the rectangular mark on the floor where the bookshelf had been placed was not a coincidence, and that he believed, based on the building's history, that the previous tenant had known about the door and had placed the bookshelf there deliberately before vacating. He could not confirm this, and the previous tenant was not locatable. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about a bookshelf fitting a space exactly, and about a faint rectangular mark on the floor, and about 2 years of sleeping on the other side of a wall from a room I did not know existed. Then I stopped thinking about it because there are some thoughts that are better finished than continued, and this was one of them. James found a door. But in story 2, what was found was not behind a door. It was inside a wall. inside a wall that had been making sounds for 3 weeks, sounds that the family had been explaining away until the night the sound stopped and something else started. This is the part that gets me every time. Here is what happened. My name is Karen. I am 42 years old. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, and 4 months ago my family spent 3 weeks hearing sounds inside the walls of our house before we did anything about it. And I want to tell you why we waited so long, because the waiting is part of the story. The sound started on a Tuesday in a wall in our upstairs hallway. Not loud sounds, irregular scratching, occasional movement, the kind of thing you heard and then questioned whether you had heard. My husband, Tom, said it was probably mice. We had never had mice, but the house was 12 years old and the neighborhood had trees, and mice were a reasonable explanation. And I accepted it because the sounds were small and intermittent, and we had a great deal going on that month. And the sounds were easy to file under probably mice and move on. For 2 weeks we filed it under probably mice. The sounds continued. They changed. Not dramatically, they did not become loud or constant, but they shifted in a way I noticed gradually, as being less random and more patterned. A scratching followed by a pause. Movement that tracked slightly over several days, from the hallway wall toward the wall of my 12-year-old daughter's bedroom. I did not tell my daughter this. I mentioned it to Tom. He said it was probably the mice moving around, and that we should call an exterminator. We called an exterminator. The exterminator came on a Thursday and assessed the accessible parts of our wall cavity, and found no evidence of mice, no droppings, no nesting material, nothing that suggested rodent activity. He said whatever was in there might be in a section of wall he could not access without opening it. He said it might also have resolved itself. He said sometimes these things did. On the Sunday night after the exterminator's visit, the sounds stopped. I noticed because I had been listening for them, and then suddenly was not hearing them, and the not hearing was louder than the hearing had been. I woke Tom at 2 a.m. and said the sounds had stopped. He said that was good. I said I did not think it was good. I said something stopping without explanation was different from something stopping because it was resolved, and that I wanted to open the wall in the morning. Tom opened the wall the following morning in the section of hallway adjacent to our daughter's bedroom. What was inside was a nest. A very large bird's nest built into the wall cavity, constructed of insulation material and some pieces of what appeared to be fabric, and containing 4 eggs that had not yet hatched and 1 egg that had hatched recently, evidenced by shell fragments and the specific smell of a recently hatched egg, and no bird. The bird had hatched something and then, apparently, found a way out of the wall cavity, through an external gap that the exterminator subsequently found and sealed. The sounds had been a bird building a nest and laying eggs, and eventually hatching one of them inside our wall over 3 weeks. Specifically inside the wall adjacent to my daughter's bedroom. My daughter, when we told her, wanted to see the eggs. We let her look. She asked if the baby bird was okay. We told her we thought so. She asked if we could keep the nest. We told her we thought that was okay. The nest is on a shelf in her room now, the unhatched eggs still inside it. She researched and found they would not hatch without the parent bird's warmth, which had been present in the wall, and was not present anymore. She has named the nest. She has not named the eggs individually, but she has named the nest. I think about the 3 weeks of sounds, and about the movement toward her bedroom, and about a bird that had apparently decided that the wall next to a 12-year-old's room was the right place to build something. And I do not draw any conclusions from this, because conclusions would be irresponsible. But I think about it. Update, 3 months later. My daughter did a school project on European starlings last month. The species the exterminator identified from feathers left in the wall cavity. She presented it to her class and included photographs of the nest, and a section about how starlings find cavities in walls and structures to nest in. Her teacher told her it was the most unusual primary source material she had seen in 12 years of teaching. My daughter was pleased. The nest is still on her shelf. She dusts around it carefully. The wall has been repaired and repainted. If you did not know there had been a nest inside it, you would not know. I know. I walk past that wall every day and I know, and I think about a bird making a decision about where to build something, and about 3 weeks of small sounds, and about my daughter's careful dusting. And I think that some things that start as frightening end as something you are unexpectedly glad happened. and that this was one of them. Karen's wall had a nest. But story 3 had something inside it too. Something that had not been put there by nature. Something that had been put there by a person. A person who had known the house very well, and who had left something behind that was never meant to be found. Wait, it gets stranger. Here is what was inside. My name is David. I am 47 years old. I live in Louisville, Kentucky, and 2 years ago my contractor opened a wall during a kitchen renovation and found a safe. Not a small safe, a substantial one, built into the wall cavity and bolted to the studs, clearly installed professionally and with the intention of permanence. The house had been built in 1954 and had had 3 owners before us. The safe had a combination lock. The contractor photographed it and called me over, and we stood in my kitchen and looked at it for a while without saying much. I contacted the previous owner, a woman named Helen who had sold us the house 4 years earlier and who was 81 years old and living in a retirement community 2 hours away. Helen said she had not known the safe was there. She said the house had been her husband's family home and that her husband, who had passed away 12 years earlier, had handled everything structural and that she had not been involved in the walls. She said her husband's name was George, and that George had been a man who had kept things to himself, and that a safe in the kitchen wall was, she said with a specific dry tone, consistent with George. A locksmith opened the safe. The opening took 3 hours and was significantly more expensive than I had anticipated, and was worth every dollar. The safe contained the following items. I am going to list them because the list is the story. $47,000 in cash, bundled in denominations that suggested the bundles had been made in the 1970s based on the bill dates. 3 passports, all American, all with George's photograph, all with different names. A handgun and 2 boxes of ammunition. A folder of documents that took our attorney and a private investigator named Marcus 6 months to fully understand. The documents, Marcus eventually determined, related to a period in George's life before his marriage to Helen in which George had been involved, peripherally and then less peripherally, with an organization that Marcus described as operating in a legal gray area that had subsequently become a definitively illegal area. George had apparently accumulated the cash, obtained the alternative passports, and stored the handgun during a period in which he had been genuinely uncertain whether he would need to leave the country quickly, and under a different name. He had never needed to. He had married Helen, moved into her family's house, built a quiet life, and apparently simply never dealt with the contents of the safe, had locked it in the wall, and, as Helen confirmed when Marcus explained everything to her, had never mentioned it. Helen's reaction was the most remarkable part of the entire experience. She listened to Marcus explain what the documents indicated about George's earlier life, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said George had always been very private about his past, and that she had decided early in their marriage that his past was his own, and that she had not asked, and he had not told, and they had been married for 41 years, and he had been a good husband, and she supposed she had been right not to ask. I asked her what she wanted to do with the information. She said she was 81 years old and George had been dead for 12 years, and she thought the information could stay where it was in terms of her understanding of her husband, and that she would like the cash and the passports returned to her to handle as she saw fit. We returned them. We kept the handgun for the police, who were mildly interested, and then less interested when it became clear that the applicable statutes of limitations had long since passed on anything the documents might have indicated. Helen passed away 8 months after our conversation. I think about George sometimes. I think about a man who built a quiet life over something complicated and who kept it in a wall, and who went 40 years without needing it, and was apparently at peace with that. I think that is either very impressive or very troubling, and that I am genuinely uncertain which. Update. 4 months later. Helen's estate attorney contacted us after Helen's passing to let us know that Helen had left us a small bequest. A handwritten note and a bottle of wine from her and George's wedding year, 1962. The note said she had appreciated how carefully we had handled what we found, and that she hoped we were happy in George's house, and that George had loved that kitchen. The wine is on a shelf in our living room. We have not opened it. I am not entirely sure we will. There is something about a 1962 bottle of wine from a woman who spent 41 years with a man whose safe She never asked about that. Seems like it deserves to stay closed. At least for now. George's safe stayed closed. For decades. But in story 4, what had been closed was not a safe. It was a conversation. A conversation that a family had been avoiding for years, until their house forced them to have it in the most unexpected way possible. Here is what the house showed them. My name is Michelle. I am 39 years old. I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, and for 4 months last year my household was woken at approximately 3 a.m. by the same sound, a single, clear, resonant knock from somewhere in the house that was loud enough to wake a light sleeper, and that came from a direction and at a volume that shifted slightly each night in ways that made it impossible to localize consistently. My husband, Greg, is a sound sleeper who heard it approximately half the times it occurred, and attributed it each time to the house settling. I am a light sleeper who heard it every single time and who attributed it, by the end of month 2, to something worth investigating. The investigation went through several phases. Phase 1 was my husband walking through the house at 3 a.m. on the nights he heard it and finding nothing. Phase 2 was me setting up my phone to record audio from the hallway on a timer, which captured the sound clearly on 3 separate nights and confirmed that it was real, consistent in character, and originating from the general direction of our basement. Phase 3 was a home inspector named Pete who spent an afternoon in our basement and found nothing that explained a single knock at 3 a.m. Phase 4 was a plumber who found nothing. Phase 5 was an HVAC technician who found nothing but who mentioned as he was leaving that thermal expansion in certain types of pipe fittings could occasionally produce a single knock sound as temperatures changed overnight, and that 3 a.m. was a common time for household temperatures to reach their overnight low. Phase 6 was me spending 2 weeks documenting the outdoor temperature at 3 a.m. each night against whether the knock occurred. The correlation was not perfect, but it was present. The knock occurred more reliably on nights when the overnight low was lower, and less reliably when the temperature was mild. Phase 7 was Greg, finally persuaded that this was worth more than a passing explanation, going into the basement with the HVAC technician's information, and examining the pipe fittings in the section of basement that corresponded to the audio recording's direction. He found a section of copper pipe with a fitting that had been installed at some point in the house's history, in a way that created a small gap that expanded and contracted with temperature changes, and that produced, when the contraction reached a certain point, a single clear knock. The fitting was replaced in an afternoon. The knocking stopped. What I want to tell you about this story is not the pipe fitting. It is what happened during the 4 months of investigation. My husband and I had been, before the knocking started, in a quiet period of our marriage. Not bad, not dramatic, but the specific quietness of 2 people who had become efficient at coexisting and had stopped being curious about each other. The investigation changed this. Not because of the investigation itself, because of the 3 a.m. Because being woken at 3 a.m. repeatedly, and having something unexplained in your house produces a specific kind of middle-of-the-night conversation that daytime life does not easily produce. We talked at 3 a.m. in ways we had not talked in years. About the house, about what we wanted it to be, about our daughter who was leaving for college in 2 years, about what we wanted our life to look like when she was gone. The knock was a pipe fitting. The 4 months were something else. The fitting has been replaced. The conversations have continued. Update 3 months later. Greg and I went away for a weekend last month. The first time we had done that in 6 years. We went to a small town 3 hours away that neither of us had been to before, and we stayed in a bed and breakfast. And we walked around and ate at restaurants we had picked randomly, and talked the way we had been talking at 3 a.m. for 4 months. On the second morning Greg said the knocking had been annoying, and also that he was glad it had happened. I said I knew what he meant. We drove home on Sunday afternoon, and the house was quiet when we walked in, and the quiet felt different than it had before. Full rather than empty, ours rather than just occupied. I think about a pipe fitting sometimes. I think about what 4 months of 3 a.m. had produced that a weekend away was now building on. I think the pipe fitting was the best home repair we have ever had done. Michelle's knock was a pipe fitting. Our final story tonight. Story 5, also starts with something ordinary. A smell. A smell that kept coming back. In a house where nothing should have been producing it. And when they finally found the source, it was not in the house. It was under it. And what was under it had been there for a very long time. Here is the last story. My name is Patricia. I am 53 years old. I live in Savannah, Georgia, and 3 years ago my house developed a smell. Not an obvious smell, a subtle, intermittent one that I noticed first in the corner of my living room near the exterior wall, and that came and went without pattern, and that I spent 8 months trying to identify and eliminate before discovering its source in a way that I had not anticipated, and that produced consequences I had not expected. The smell was earthy and faintly organic in a way that suggested something biological, without being immediately identifiable as anything specific. I had the house inspected for mold. No mold. I had it inspected for pest activity. No significant activity. I had the HVAC system cleaned. I had the crawl space under the living room assessed by a contractor named Frank who found nothing unusual beyond the age-appropriate moisture levels of a house built in 1931. The smell persisted. I hired a different contractor 8 months after the smell began. A woman named Sandra who specialized in historic home restoration, and who had more experience with 1930s construction than Frank had. Sandra went into the crawl space with a flashlight and more time than Frank had spent and came out an hour later, and said she had found something, and that she thought I should see it. What Sandra had found, in a section of the crawl space that Frank had apparently not fully accessed, was a depression in the soil approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide that appeared to be deliberately shaped, and that contained, below a layer of soil that Sandra had carefully moved, the remains of what a subsequent archaeological assessment determined was a structure. A wooden structure, small, with brick elements, that had predated the house's 1931 construction, and that the County Historical Society, called in after Sandra's discovery, identified as the probable remains of a root cellar or small outbuilding from what they estimated was the mid to late 1800s based on the brick style and construction method. The structure contained artifacts, household items, tools, some ceramic pieces, and in a corner that the Historical Society's archaeologist examined with particular care, a collection of items that the archaeologist identified as consistent with objects documented as belonging to enslaved people in the antebellum South. Items that people had kept, the archaeologist said, because they mattered to them and that had been preserved here, under a house built 60 years later, in soil that had kept them through the intervening century and a half. The Historical Society spent 3 months documenting the site. Our street, it emerged through the research the discovery prompted, had a history that the current neighborhood had largely lost track of. The land had been part of a larger property in the antebellum period, and the discovery under my house prompted research that identified 4 other properties on our street as having similar histories, though no similar physical remnants had been found. The smell had come from the organic decomposition process of the wooden structure, accessed through gaps in the foundation that the age of the house had produced. Sandra sealed the foundation gaps after the Historical Society completed their work. The smell stopped. The Historical Society erected a small marker at the end of our street, acknowledging the history the research had documented. I think about the 8 months of smell sometimes, and about Frank not finding anything, and about Sandra taking more time, and about what was under my house the whole time, and about the people who had kept those items, and what it had meant to keep them, and I think that some things stay in the ground because the ground is the only place that will hold them across that many years, and that being the person whose house sits above them, and whose knows eventually, notice something is a specific kind of responsibility that I am still figuring out how to carry. Update. 4 months later, the Historical Society published a report last month on the research that the discovery had prompted. My house is referenced in it by address. The archaeologist who led the site assessment sent me a copy with a handwritten note that said the discovery had been one of the most significant finds in her career, in terms of what it had added to the documented history of the neighborhood. I read the report carefully. There is a section that describes the items found in the corner of the structure, each one catalogued and photographed, and described with the care that the Historical Society had brought to the entire process. I looked at the photographs of the items for a long time. I thought about the people who had kept them, and about a root cellar, and about a house built over it in 1931, and about 8 months of a smell that had led, through Frank and Sandra and the Historical Society and 3 months of research and a published report, to a section of photographs of things that people had kept because they mattered. I thought that the smell was the right way for it to have been found, and that found was better than not found, and that I was glad Sandra had taken more time. I am still figuring out how to carry it. I think I will be figuring that out for a while.